Good evening. My name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral here in San Francisco, California, and welcome to the Forum. Every year, the Cathedral chooses a theme, and our theme this year is bridges. We're looking for ways to connect with people who may be distant from us. It's been a very exciting theme this year, and we've been talking about how we form those kinds of connections. For this 3-week period, though, we've been studying the justice system and talking about it from 3 different perspectives. Last week, we had Chesa Boudin, the district attorney of San Francisco. Next week, we're hearing from a former prisoner. And this week, we're hearing from Lara Bazelon, attorney, professor, and the director of the Criminal and Juvenile Justice and Racial Justice Clinics at the University of San Francisco, and author of Rectify, The Power of Restorative Justice After Wrongful Conviction. Tonight, we'll be talking about breaking down stereotypes and preconceptions about crime and justice, and the hard questions about what's right and fair, and what's possible in our lifetime. Laura, I'm so glad to see you, and I'm sitting right across from where you were when you were last at our house. So this is probably like the same view you looked at when we last had dinner together.
I remember that beautiful window and that night. And yeah, I'm excited for us to someday be in person again.
Yeah, I just can't wait. And you know, I've been spending the last 2 weeks with your book, Rectify, and it's just been giving me like the most vivid dreams. I read these stories and they're unfolding in my dream life, and it's been a huge blessing to me. There's such compelling stories, and it really made me grateful for people like you who are really on the front lines of making sure that our society becomes more just. And the criminal justice system seems so complicated, and you've got one of the best minds of anyone I know, and I'm grateful that you're working on these problems.
That is incredibly kind of you to say. Thank you.
The first question that I wanted to ask, though, is about forgiveness. There are so many experiences that you've had with people who've been wrongfully convicted, and so much that you know. What has these experiences as a lawyer taught you about forgiveness? It's something we all need help with, and so we're anxious for any suggestions you might have.
It's taught me a lot about forgiveness, and I wish I could say that primarily it's taught me about forgiveness as a lawyer, but I'm going to be completely honest with you and say that it's taught me about forgiveness in my own life as a human being. And that's because I've seen people in these legal contexts do the unthinkable, which is having gone through so much suffering wittingly or unwittingly at the hands of someone else in a way that probably you and I could never imagine, being taken away from our families, being locked away, being falsely accused or mistakenly accused. They're able to offer forgiveness to that person or that entity that inflicted a harm on them. And so, I mean, for me, it was really startling in the sense that I've always, unfortunately, been a rather grudge-holding and vengeful person. And it really made me rethink that mentality, because it's not only not grace, the way that I have come to think about offering someone grace, but it's also just not a healthy way to live. And when you see people who are just burdened immensely offer this gift to someone else, you think, okay, well, if this person can do this, certainly I could try the same.
Sorry. Yeah, it's funny. There's the Lord's Prayer, which is like the most basic thing that Jesus taught. Forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. And there are times in your book when you have people who, crime victims who, in part through the circumstances, they're kind of set up almost to be part of this conviction machine for someone, and they carry around the sense of guilt. And some of those conversations between the person who's been incarcerated for all that time and the person also who suffered as a victim and then suffered finding out that they were part of this wrongful conviction. Those are some of the most powerful parts of the book for me.
Yeah, to me, what's so powerful about it is how healing it is when you realize that you realize that really both people can offer the other something that no one else in the world can. I'm so sorry about the dog. That you have this experience that's really unique, and that one person has been severely harmed and the other person feels uniquely responsible for that harm. And they together have this like 360-degree view of this crime and what's happened, and can offer each other a sort of solace and understanding in a way that no one else in the system has been able to provide. It's like this extrajudicial way of healing. And I do think of it as spiritual, even though obviously it's not a religion. Restorative justice is not a religion. It comes from this heartfelt place that I think people who are spiritual can really relate to. And I think may in some way be like a necessary corrective to a system that goes wrong in the sense that it wrongfully convicts, but also goes wrong because it says to victims, we will heal the harm that you feel by meting out this conviction in this extreme sentence. And I think for many people that is not healing. They're told that it will be, but they don't experience it as repairing the damage that they have suffered. And oftentimes it's really about coming face to face with the person who's behind what happened and really hearing from them. That's a big piece of connecting those dots and just coming to a different place in their sort of processing of this unfathomable thing that's happened to them.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I mean, as people come to me with problems when they get divorced, when if someone dies, when they lose their job. I mean, but the vast majority of people come to me because of questions having to do with forgiveness. And so it's almost like, I think we almost need some like basic instruction about what forgiveness is. And I mean, my shorthand for forgiveness is it's being able to leave the past in the past, so that it's not, the ramifications aren't continuing to unfold in ways that leave you powerless and leave you wounded and hurt. But it's hard. It's a hard process. And you're right, it's spiritual because there seems to be a kind of power that's beyond us that helps us to move ahead in ways that seem like they would be impossible. And that's what your book is. It's full of miracles of these men who've lost 30 years of their lives and yet are still able to be kind human beings, be empathetic to the people who are suffering around them. It's a really powerful testimony, I think.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. It was powerful to hear and experience. And actually, it's interesting. I mean, I first started thinking about it because I represented somebody who had been wrongfully convicted, and he had been in prison for 34 years before we were able to get him out. And it was a very adversarial process. And it was interesting. I mean, coming out of it, I actually felt a lot of extreme anger kind of on his behalf. And one part of it that was really moving and kind of changed my mind about who was suffering and to what degree, not to take away from what he went through, was that the victim's family had really been told this lie by the state for 3.5 decades, and then watched it kind of unravel during the retrial, and just kind of putting yourself in that position and thinking about like the kind of pain that they were going through, right? I mean, they were suffering as well. And then I think my client was just a real example because he was able to, as you say, put the past in the past. He was able to do that in a way that really just was astounding. I think he is a person of faith. His mother is a person of faith. It came from that place, but it was inspiring because you just think to yourself, he could spend the rest of his life quite justifiably being angry and bitter. And he's sort of making a choice not to do that and to live a good life. And part of that, I think, really involves sort of coming to terms with what happened in a way that allowed him to heal and move on. So watching him go through that was the inspiration really for me to kind of search more deeply and talk to other people who had been through a similar experience.
Yeah, I was curious about that just because it does seem like just a really formative experience, because your legal career could have gone in many different ways. But that seems to have been a very powerful thing in setting the trajectory of what you're doing.
Yeah, it was. I think it was the most transformative experience of my life. And I say that not only because I think it's probably sort of professionally the most important thing I'll ever do, but also because it just has had all of these continuing repercussions. And just going back to what we were speaking about earlier, I realized that you don't have to be wrongfully convicted or rightfully convicted or have been a victim of crime to think more carefully about the power of forgiveness. You really just have to have broken relationships in your own life. And while his case was going on, I was going through a lot of turmoil in my own personal life. And interestingly, that intersected in a way that I think really allowed me to come to terms and really grapple with what was happening in a way that I think was healthier for me and for my family in the long run than if I hadn't taken any kind of personal lessons away from it. And so I do think learning about restorative justice has made me a better lawyer in the sense that I see more options, I see more opportunities, and my students and I are able to sometimes engage with it with our clients, which is fantastic. But I actually feel like, and this is sort of what I want to get across to anybody who's listening, that it really can apply in your own life.
Yeah, and I'll second that. And just seeing you, your sense of grace and forgiveness in your own, in the challenges that you faced are a testimony too. And I think it's amazing that you could see such suffering and have it somehow work some kind of good in your own suffering. It's an amazing thing, and that's what I mean. That forgiveness it's a miracle to behold every single time it happens. It comes from somewhere which we just don't understand. There were so many things in your book that were so powerful to me, and things that were upsetting and things that were uplifted. But I think that if there's one statistic that stood out the most for me, it was that 48% of the people who've been wrongfully convicted of crimes were convicted of a crime as a result of some kind of misconduct, not just by police, but by prosecutors. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that too, because it seems really, if you're not in that adversarial system and if your daily life is not trying to find the truth in that way, it seems really upsetting to think that 48% of those cases that somebody was responsible for it. So it wasn't quite an accident. It was intentional, if you know what I mean.
Sorry, I had to unmute. It is really upsetting. And I think it's very hard for people to wrap their minds around, because I think we're used to thinking about the police as people we can trust who are going to do the right thing, and prosecutors as the men and women wearing the white hats. And unfortunately, either because of bad training and bad practices, or as you say, sort of intentionally just wanting to win at all costs, there is a lot of official misconduct that goes on. And it's really a range. Right now we have an interesting case in the clinic where our client, the evidence against our client was a cross-racial show-up identification. Now, this was in 2013, not in 1918. And basically, the description was that the gunman who committed this armed robbery that took a couple of minutes in the dark was a young Black man. And they grabbed our client off the street about 20 hours later. And rather than do the right thing, which was to conduct a live lineup or maybe have the victim look at photographs, they brought him into the station late at night. He was terrified. And they asked him, is this the guy? And our client was in handcuffs. There were police on all sides of him, and there was a spotlight being shown in his face. And the victim said yes. And that was the whole case. And that's a form of misconduct in the sense that those are just the worst possible practices that you could ever imagine. That's not how you're supposed to identify someone. You're not supposed to just give them one option and basically sort of suggest that they pick that person. But for whatever reason, they didn't want to do the work. They weren't invested in trying to actually do anything fair. That was the procedure that they used. And then because his lawyers were really terrible and didn't present evidence that he was 8 miles away, the jury convicted him. And that's just kind of the standard thing that happens in jurisdictions all over the country, where they'll just use these show up IDs and pretend that they're valid when they're not. And they're even worse when they're cross-racial, because people of different races have a hard time identifying each other. And then you go from there all the way to things like hiding evidence that if the jury had heard it, they would have rendered a different verdict. All kinds of things where there are, offers made and deals and side deals with witnesses, and they're essentially being bought off or paid off, and the jury isn't told that. So it's this wide spectrum of misconduct and bad practices. And unfortunately, the result of that is that hundreds and hundreds of people are wrongfully convicted.
Yeah, that was one of the most powerful things to me too, is just kind of those jailhouse snitch situations where somebody who's incarcerated already benefits from wrongfully being part of the wrongful conviction of somebody else. It just seems like an impossible situation. It's hard to believe that happens. But that's another thing that I think is so wonderful about the book too, is that, you do so much to talk about. Like 25 years ago, there was much more of a sense that if someone was in prison, then there was the sense that they were guilty. And since then, we've seen so many wrongful conviction cases that it's really changed our consciousness about that. And I wonder if you can just kind of talk about that, the history of that change in consciousness? Because and when I say that, it's not like thorough enough. I think more people need to know your story about how many wrongful convictions there are, but there is much more of a consciousness of it. And I wonder if you can talk about, those DNA tests and in other examples that have kind of brought us to this place where we recognize that just because somebody's in prison doesn't mean that they are rightfully there.
It's really interesting because it's happened in our lifetime. So by the mid-1990s, the United States Supreme Court was confronted with this question. If you have all of your legal remedies exhausted, but you're still claiming to be innocent, and that's your only claim, can you bring that claim forward? And essentially the Supreme Court laughed it off. And they said, that's just a ridiculous situation because trials are, maybe they're not perfect, but they're very, very close to perfect. And wrongful convictions really are extremely rare. And I think Justice Scalia, in concurring, said something like, hopefully we'll never have to deal with such a ridiculous question ever again. And then fast forward a couple of years, and then we had our first DNA exoneration. And all of a sudden, it was really clear that there was this 100% positive scientific way to demonstrate innocence. And then more and more people were freed using DNA evidence. And then that opened the door to cases like my clients where we didn't have DNA evidence. And it was more just proving the kind of misconduct that we've been talking about underlay that conviction. And then in fact, if the jury had known the truth that the witnesses had essentially been bought off and the police had committed all kinds of misconduct, they never would have convicted. And so I think the DNA exonerations led to the non-DNA exonerations because they opened people's mind to this idea that this system wasn't infallible and that it wasn't ridiculous to question whether or not it had catastrophically failed in a way that we had not designed it to correct. And so we've seen since the 1990s this real revolution in not just the DNA exonerations, but also the non-DNA exonerations. And it does raise this question, and I always wonder this, of how much of that's filtering into the minds of people who are sitting on juries every day. Are they thinking, wow, the presumption of innocence is a real thing, and I need to really stick to that and come to this case from a place of skepticism? Or are they looking at a defendant and saying, gee, I wonder what this person did?
Yeah, I think of that, just the analysis that you have about the estimate from the University of Michigan study that 4% of the death row cases in Michigan are people who are wrongfully imprisoned. And then translating to what would that mean for a prison population of 1.5 million. And so you come to the conclusion between 15,000 and 62,000 innocent people at any given point, at any moment, are in prison. And it made me wonder what it is. What can we do for people like that? So many of the cases you described, it almost seems miraculous that the people were able to get out. But I wonder, what's being done for all those other people who are in prison so unnecessarily.
So I'm feeling slightly more hopeful about this question than I used to be. And that's because in the last 5 or so years, we've had this real movement to elect district attorneys who are progressive. That's the word that's used. They're called progressive prosecutors. And you mentioned that you had our DA, Chesabuddin, on last week, and he certainly fits within that mold. He might be the most progressive prosecutor in the United States. And essentially what's different about people like Chesabuddin or Larry Krasner, Eric Gonzalez, various players, Kim Fox, Kim Gardner, who have run and won on these reform platforms, is they've all pledged to review these cases very, very seriously and put a lot of political stakes and willpower into that effort. And so as a result of that, you have district attorneys in major cities starting these post-conviction units or starting various commissions to look back at these cases. And so rather than have a stance of fighting tooth and nail to preserve a conviction, no matter how ill-gotten it was, we are now on this path, I think, of electing people who have the opposite view, which is that they understand that justice is a very broad concept. And for a prosecutor, doing justice may actually mean falling on one sword and admitting error. So that makes me more hopeful.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because you when you write about Pennsylvania and wrongful convictions there, you write about just like the polity, like how your whether your state is a commonwealth or a state, how the different parts of law enforcement are connected or not connected. And so there is that kind of a governance question. There's certain forms of governance that are more likely to lead to error. And that was an interesting part of the analysis too.
Yeah, that's true. And I think a lot of it depends on training. It was interesting to look at Pennsylvania and look at Philadelphia in particular, because it really seemed like the police chief who was there when I was writing the book was very, very committed to reform, very committed to looking at, for example, recording interrogation so that there wasn't misconduct, revamping identification procedures, someone who was just very, very committed to justice rather than kind of old practices that he recognized were not working. And then, of course, at the very end of the book, the people of Philadelphia elected a district attorney who was extremely progressive, and now they have a robust conviction review unit. So it is interesting to look at Pennsylvania, or Philadelphia in particular, as a test case of a city that went from being pretty regressive and pretty terrible when it came to these issues to being really on the vanguard of cutting edge reforms. And so that's a hopeful story.
Yeah, it does. It does give you a sense of hope. You mentioned other causes of mistakes and other reasons why people end up behind bars wrongly. Could you go through those for us a little bit? Because there's some like, especially things about confessions that I thought were counterintuitive and were helpful. I think our audience would be interested in the other reasons why people end up in prison when they shouldn't be there.
Sure. Well, you touched on one, and that's that people falsely confess. So somewhere between 10 and 13% of wrongful conviction cases actually involve a confession. And that is really hard for people to wrap their minds around, because most people reasonably believe that no one would ever confess to a heinous crime that he or she had nothing to do with. But what a lot of people don't understand is the kind of pressure that can be put on you when you are being interrogated by the police. And that's particularly true, for example, if you're a young person, and perhaps many people who are listening are familiar with Making a Murderer and Brendan Dassey and his so-called confession. Of course, you're talking about someone who is young, developmentally disabled. And a lot of times you have these false promises by the police, which is, we won't charge you if you just admit it. If you admit it, you can go home. Going back to, for example, the Central Park 5 case, where they got these so-called confessions from these 5 young men. And of course, they were exonerated by DNA. So that happens more than people think. And unfortunately, once there is a confession, it's very hard to undo that. Jurors just think, okay, well, then you did it, and that's why you said you did it. So that's certainly one. Misidentification is another one, and it's very powerful, because sometimes people really believe. I don't have a doubt, for example, in the case that my students and I have in Louisiana, that this victim believed that my client robbed him, but he's wrong. My client was 8 miles away. And that kind of testimony is really damning, because the person isn't making it up and they're not being offered anything. They truly believe they're pointing to the right person. And when they're asked, they'll say, like, I'm 110% sure, I would bet my life on it. And so if you're a juror listening to that, that's very, very, very compelling evidence. And then another unfortunate cause is just bad defense lawyering. We talked about misconduct, which certainly happens with prosecutors holding back evidence. But another big problem is just that a lot of attorneys are asleep at the wheel, and it's incredibly unfortunate. They don't do the work, they're underpaid, they're overworked, whatever it is, but they don't mount the defense that they're supposed to, that they have to under the Constitution. And unfortunately, of course, those attorneys tend to be the attorneys who are representing people who don't have any money.
Yeah, it's funny because now I think about all your students, and it's almost important to remind them just like what they're learning is life and death consequences,
And I think it's also just really important to know, I mean, I was really lucky. I was a federal public defender, and I was lucky in the sense that my office was pretty well resourced and the expectations were incredibly high, but our caseload was relatively decent. So I wasn't feeling like completely overwhelmed that I had hundreds and hundreds of cases and I was basically just meeting people and pleading them out. That was never my experience. But I think even some people who go into being a public defender really optimistic and aspirational can end up in these offices that are completely underfunded by the city or by the state. They have hundreds of cases. They don't have enough time to investigate them. And they're not even able to do a good job, even if they want to. And that's really a crisis in how we use money and how we allocate money. And a lot of times in those jurisdictions, you'll see the prosecutors making twice as much and the DAs getting more funding. And I think that is another unfortunate cause of wrongful convictions.
Yeah. One of the things I kept thinking about as I went through the book was about race and what role race plays in wrongful conviction. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that.
So probably folks will not be surprised to know that race plays an enormous outsized role in wrongful convictions in the same way that race plays an outsized role in almost every other aspect of the criminal justice system. And that's particularly true in the more serious cases. It's particularly true when it comes to crimes like murder and sexual assault. And actually, sexual assaults are the most glaring examples of these very stark disparities. And that's oftentimes because of mistaken identification. But the exonerees in sexual assault cases are Black by a number that is shocking in proportion to the percentage of people who are Black in the population, or even the percentage of people who are Black who are convicted of sexual assault versus the percentage of people who are white. And it's just a shocking statistic. On the other hand, perhaps not, because it points to what we all know, which is that systemic racism absolutely infects, and perhaps it's like the primal wound of the criminal justice system.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting that you said that, because I didn't make the connection between crimes having to do with sexuality and race, just almost magnifying the amount of hatred and anger and racism and involved in those cases. But I can certainly see how that would be the case. I've been wondering have you been watching the Supreme Court hearings that have been taking place, and I wonder just like what it looks like from your perspective. It may be have bearing on your work in race and law. It may have bearing on wrongful convictions. But I keep thinking what must be going through your head as I hear the questions from the various government officials.
So, what's going through my head, quite frankly, is a lot of disappointment. And it's disappointment for a number of reasons. I feel like these hearings have become a kind of kabuki theater where the nominees are just trained to give evasive non-answers to every single question. So if you listen, you learn nothing. They're trained to give statements that are full of nothing. And it's all just sort of driven toward getting confirmed, and often by this very bare minimum of votes, because it's become so politicized. And so it's honestly very dispiriting. It's also dispiriting because I think just the timing and the sort of the obvious ramming through of this nominee, the odd shift by the Republicans from saying that Barack Obama could not fill the seat left vacant by Justice Scalia for 9 months, but within a matter of weeks, we're going to be confirming this Trump nominee. The difference between this nominee and Ruth Bader Ginsburg in terms of their views on everything, including criminal justice, to be honest, it's very dispiriting to watch it.
Yeah, I've been worried about you as I was watching them. I wake up in the morning and Heidi's little cell phone light is glowing. I thought, oh, do I want to listen? But I have been listening because I think it's important for us to understand it. I wonder if you can just reflect a little bit about just the 2016 election. And what it means for people who are incarcerated, and what these last 4 years have been like, and what you see unfolding as the election gets nearer to us.
So, the last 4 years have been really interesting from a criminal justice perspective, in the sense that federally, in terms of the relief available to people in federal court, it's become more and more and more constricted. And it was already pretty terrible. And that's because president after president, starting with Nixon, but I'm including the Democratic presidents, including Bill Clinton, and even to some extent Barack Obama, were not willing to move away from tough on crime policies. And those were the kinds of policies that had been nailed firmly in place. And I think in the last 4 years, the course on criminal justice have shifted even farther to the right. And that by that, I mean on the federal level. And it's interesting because when I was in law school, we were always told that federal courts were the courts of last resort, and they were the courts where you could get true justice after being denied justice in the state courts. And now I feel like it's been flipped on its head, at least in a place like California, where the judiciary on the state level is getting more and more and more progressive. And then in fact, the real remedies and the real chance for a decent outcome seems to lie in state court more than federal court. Now, that's not true in every state, but it is true more and more that on a local level, you're more likely to get a just outcome, unfortunately, than you are on the federal level. And that's just something that I've been observing. And of course, our Attorney General, William Barr, has denied that there is systemic racism. Our president has said very, well, I don't want to get into all of the things that he said because we'd be here all night, but suffice it to say that it's not really a fertile ground for reform. But on the state and local level, I'm seeing more and more that there is that energy and there is that focus, because people are realizing the cost of mass incarceration.
Yeah. What would 4 more years of Donald Trump's presidency mean just for you and for the justice system?
So I think that what it would mean is a rollback of a number of important rights that people have relied on for a long time. So I think that it will be really the wrecking ball that will crush, for example, the Affordable Care Act. I think that probably a Trump court will undo Roe versus Wade, but I also think that he will continue to cement this very, very conservative majority at the trial and the appellate level in federal courts. And that's something people are so focused on the Supreme Court, they sometimes forget that 99% of these cases actually don't end up there. And now it seems that when you get to the kind of trial court and appellate level, more and more, it's these very, very conservative judges who are deciding outcomes. And so I think that would just get even more extreme. And my guess is that as that gets more extreme, the local push for reform will move in the opposite direction. And so what I see is those things being more and more in tension and moving farther and farther away from each other, at least in places that are democratically controlled.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, it's really hard to know what's going to happen, but I do know there's definitely a lot of anxiety among the people I talk to just about what's coming up.
Yes, and there's a lot, and I think justifiably so. And there's a lot of anxiety, among my students and my colleagues and other lawyers who are really invested in these issues and have spent their life fighting for these issues. On the other hand, I will say this: it's not as if we're sort of nostalgically looking back at the good old days of the 1980s and the 1990s and the early 2000s. I mean, truly, once we saw the end of the Warren Court and the expansion of many kinds of constitutional rights in the late 70s, we've never come back from that. We've gone right and increasingly conservative. And so this is a more extreme version, but the good old days are very far in the past in terms of having a Supreme Court or high federal courts who are really interested in the expansion of individual rights.
Yeah, that's very true. And as we were talking about earlier, the people who have living memories of that way of being in court are getting smaller and smaller. So and it's hard to convey that, I think, probably to your students and to your kids when it's time to talk to them about these things. It's hard to describe about what it was like before.
Yeah, it is. Whoops, it is, and it's funny because it's especially strange for me because my grandfather was a federal judge. He was a judge on the District of Columbia Court of Appeals. He was the chief judge, and that's the court where Ruth Bader Ginsburg came from, and it's the court where Brett Kavanaugh came from. It's called a heartbeat away from the Supreme Court. It's in District of Columbia, and he was an extremely liberal, progressive judge, a very prescient thinker, and he was a judge in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And it's just hard to imagine someone that liberal having the kind of sway and the kind of power that he had in his era.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I think about that too. And just even what counts as liberal. I mean, opinions about abortion were much more mixed in 1972 before it became kind of like a religious issue. There are people on both sides in terms of the religion, and people's perception of issues like that have changed so much. It's almost like, also there's the technology too. We're dealing with just a seismic change in how human beings communicate with each other, and it's kind of hard to disentangle that experience of online internet, the demise of normal journalism as we knew it 20 years ago. It's those things have an effect on everything too. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about restorative justice, though. That was one of my favorite sections too. It's just like I love the creativity and the spirit behind it. But how did you first come across restorative justice, and what have you learned about it as time's gone on?
I kind of stumbled on it. And then once I did, I got really interested in it because, again, it seemed like a remedy to some of the problems that you and I have been talking about, this way of going outside of the system and empowering the people who are most impacted by it. But basically, it reframes fundamental questions. In the criminal system, we're always asking, who committed the crime, and what punishment do they deserve. And with restorative justice, we're asking different questions. We're asking who is harmed, what are that person's needs, and who is obligated to meet those needs. And when you reframe it in that way, what you realize is that you can actually bring, in some circumstances, you can bring the parties together. You can bring the person who's committed the crime or inflicted the harm and the harmed party into the same place, with hopefully a trained facilitator, or even in a broader circle involving members of their community, to dig down into the root causes of what caused the harm, what caused the harmful conduct, get that person to really dig down and reflect, have the person who's been harmed speak very personally to their own experience as the person who was harmed, and then to have the parties kind of make a plan for repair going forward. It's hard to describe, but when you see it in action, it's incredibly powerful.
Do you have an example of a case which you might share that might help give us a better picture of it?
The case that moved me the most was this case that I followed a little bit in my book, and it involved this woman in Oklahoma who she is a Caucasian woman, and when she was younger, when she was in college, a Black male stranger broke into her home and violently sexually assaulted her, and she misidentified that person and testified against him in court, and he was sentenced to a long sentence. And then the DNA that was recovered was tested some years later and ended up exonerating him. And that just compounded her trauma by a factor of 10, because she then felt responsible for what had happened to this person who she believed had been her attacker, but actually wasn't. And I watched them come together at a retreat and engage in restorative justice. And it was incredibly powerful, because it was very difficult for her to be there and to listen to his story and what he had been through and all of the things that he had lost during his time in prison, including his family and his job and his sense of justice and his place in the world. And it became extremely difficult for her to physically be there, to the point where it was overwhelming and she had to leave at various points. And then at the end of the circle, they had an activity afterwards, because they do at this retreat, they mix in kind of lighthearted or more casual conversations with this really deep and heavy discussion that they're having. And so they were having a campfire, and she said, I'll never be able to forgive myself. And listening to you has made it even more clear, well, I'll never be able to forgive myself. And he got a little bit angry with her, and he said, you have to forgive yourself, because if you can't, I can't move forward with my own healing. It's very important for me that you be able to do that. And it was this really interesting breakthrough. It wasn't in the circle, but it was them talking afterwards that I think moved her farther forward toward understanding that she needed to give him that she needed to be able to forgive herself, so that he wasn't kind of carrying around the burden of her pain and her upset. And it was a really interesting way of watching these two people who'd been so damaged find each other and connect in a way that I thought was really powerful.
Yeah, it reminds me of when Martin Luther King Jr. preached at Grace Cathedral. He talked about that inescapable web, that net that connects all of us, so that our welfare is bound up in each other's. In a way, that's what he was saying is, my ability to be happy is connected to your happiness. Whether you chose that or didn't chose that, we're connected. But yeah, I wonder if you could talk too a little bit about just like what kind of organizations are out there to help people, who've been wrongfully imprisoned and to kind of reintegrate into society and to become whole again. What kind of resources are available for people in that situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. And unfortunately, not that many. So of course, there are Innocence Projects, and I'm sure many people have heard of those, and they're really devoted to getting people out of prison. And that's extremely important to do. They tend to be staffed with lawyers who aren't social workers or reentry experts. And so the problem is that a lot of times the clients will get exonerated, and then maybe there's a flurry of media attention, and then maybe they'll get some money or maybe not. It really depends on your state. It's kind of a freak of geography, whether or not your state will compensate you or whether you can win a lawsuit. But then it's sort of like, okay, good luck. And this person, unlike a person, say, who's been rightfully convicted and is on parole and has a parole officer and a check-in, they just don't have anything. And sometimes their families are gone or estranged. And it can be extremely difficult for them to readjust. And so one thing that I've been thinking about a lot is the importance of developing more organizations that are really geared toward helping exonerees once they've been exonerated and once the media has gone away. And once that lump sum payment has been spent, because you're really talking about the rest of somebody's life. And it's so important to try to reintegrate them and to support them and to give them hope that they can live a normal life. And I don't think we have enough of that.
Yeah. And I imagine probably something too for the people who are, those victims, the crime victims, which you said a number of times are kind of victimized twice. Once they're victimized as the victim of the crime, and then they're kind of co-opted into the system of wrongfully prosecuting somebody else and having to realize the implications of that too.
Yes, I think a lot of times they're not told or not offered the chance to have restorative justice, and it takes the right victim and the right offender or wrongfully convicted person at the right moment in their lives, as someone in the book said very powerfully and correctly. But a lot of times people have been harmed by the system don't even know that they have that option, and they're certainly not offered it. And I think that's right. Like, there's plenty of pain to go around, and it certainly includes the victims and the victims' families.
Yeah, definitely. I felt that very powerfully in reading the book, for sure. You were a public defender yourself, and I wonder if you can talk about just kind of what drew you to that, and kind of what fed your soul in that, and what some of the challenges that work were.
I really just thought that people who were accused and didn't have any money were unlikely to get a fair shake. And I think that's probably part of my family ethic and kind of the way that I was raised, to be concerned about people who were a lot less fortunate than I was and didn't have the same kind of advantages. And then when I went to law school, I think that kind of instinct was confirmed by what I was learning. And so it was something that I really wanted to try to do. And then I was lucky in that I was able to get a job after my clerkship doing that kind of work. And it's really hard. It's really emotionally draining, but it's also just incredibly important and powerful. And you are able to help people in a way that nobody else can. And the other thing that I think I would say to people who are considering that kind of a career is that you end up being surrounded by like-minded people in your own office. And that's a real sense of camaraderie. And that also fed my soul, certainly my supervisors and my colleagues. And my office was incredibly diverse and full of just fascinating people, but we were all committed to the same mission, which was effectively representing our clients.
Yeah, I love that, because you're right. That's one of the greatest blessings, is our work draws like-minded people together. And I can imagine you must have had wonderful, interesting colleagues that you learn from, and who you'd be able to be a blessing to too.
I remember my criminal procedure professor telling us in law school, you should really think about who your colleagues are, because you're going to spend more time with them than you are going to spend with anyone else in the rest of your life. And it really struck me. And I thought it would be a truly terrible thing to be surrounded by people that you could not connect to at work. Right.
It's so true. And couldn't trust or couldn't rely on, or, so we are lucky. One of the things that we do when we're in person is we take questions from our audience. And so people write down little questions and note cards, but if people will write down questions, then Rebecca will send me the questions and I can ask you the questions. And oftentimes there's just a real gem in there. But somebody has sent a question, and the question is this: I work with violent offenders and victims. Do you think that a key aspect of forgiveness is not saying that what was done is okay?
Meaning that that the person who's been harmed should never ever have to say, "I'm okay with what happened." Yes, I don't think that that's the kind of thing that you can ever ask somebody. I think that's really up to the person who's been harmed to determine to what degree they're able to sort of live with what happened. But it seems pretty out there to demand of them that they somehow make it okay. I think what we should really be asking people who've been harmed is how it's impacted them and what they need to get better and move forward. So I think demanding that of a victim is not conducive to forgiveness or to healing, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think there's a wrong impression out there that's so pervasive, and that is that forgiveness means saying that what happened wasn't bad or was okay or is acceptable or justified in some way. And I just don't believe that at all. Forgiveness is different than excusing somebody. It's just forgiveness means, that power to move beyond it, even though it was wrong or was evil or was unkind or whatever it was. It's not legitimating like what happened to the person. It's just figuring a way to get beyond it.
I agree. And I guess the other thing I would say is, I'm not trying to suggest that in every situation, the person who's been harmed and the person who's committed the harm become best friends and ride off together into the sunset. I'm not saying that. And I think it really has to be a victim-centered thing. But what I will say, and then what I've experienced in my own life and what I've seen other people experience, is that forgiveness is personally liberating, that you're actually, if you can truly forgive, you're giving yourself a gift. And that can look really different. It can look like, I have come to a point of reckoning and peace within myself, which does not necessarily mean that I want any further contact with this person who's committed the harm, right? But it's just that in your own mind, you're able to come to terms with what's happened. And as you said, leave the past in the past. And I think that's a gift that it's amazing to be able to give to yourself.
Yeah. The next question is about inequity. And that is the question about wealthy people being able to afford better representation. And when the poor cannot. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. And I think that's really what drove me more than anything to be a public defender, because I really believed that it shouldn't matter. And my feeling was, I'd been really lucky in life. I had a great family. I had a fantastic education. I had all of these credentials. I had some skills, and I could have gone to work at a law firm and made a lot of money. And I wasn't interested in doing that. What I was really interested in doing was saying to someone who had no money, having me is just as good as paying a lot of money for a lawyer. And I think the more people who do that, the less we'll have these just gross inequities. But it is absolutely true that you can buy your way into better justice. And I would be dissembling if I suggested that money doesn't make a difference. I do think, I see results that my students and I are able to produce, and the results that my colleagues, when I was a public defender, have been able to produce. I think that when you get enough people who are motivated and hardworking and zealous to do that kind of job and really work for people who have nothing, it's to some degree equalizing, but we're not anywhere close to a level playing field. And there's just no doubt that wealth makes an enormous, enormous difference.
So we have tons of questions coming in now. So it's kind of like the speeded up round where everything's going to be faster. So describe the job market for graduating law students who are interested in public service.
Sure. And actually, this is kind of ironic. I think my clients would always say things like, they were just, and this was when I was, in my 20s, and they would just be kind of horrified, thinking that I was free, so I must be terrible. Plus I was a woman and I was young, and they were just horrified by the whole situation, because in their own mind, they had this concept of what a real lawyer looked like. And it looked like, an older white-haired gentleman on television. Yeah. The truth is that that's not what the sort of good lawyer looks like. There's no such thing. But it's also true, and this always struck me as an irony, that the jobs are pretty hard to get. And so the question was about the job market. And the truth is that in San Francisco, getting a job as a public defender or as a district attorney is actually very, very difficult to do. And oftentimes people who want those jobs have to go to more remote geographic areas. For example, we have a judge speak to my students every year who, always wanted to be a DA, and he could only get a job in Fresno, so he had to live there for a while. So actually the public interest job market is very competitive.
Oh, that's great to know. I'm glad to hear that good people are being drawn into that work. Could you talk about the death penalty? Will we ever see it end?
I was more optimistic about that during the Obama administration than I am now. I do believe that we will see the death penalty end in California. I think we've gotten close a couple of times, and I think it's really just, I think that the death penalty is on its way out. We have a moratorium right now, and I think that we are moving in that direction. I don't think with the current makeup of the United States Supreme Court that we will have the death penalty declared unconstitutional. And I think that's unfortunate because, in my opinion, there's no doubt that it's cruel and unusual, because it's racist, because it's barbaric in the terms of the suffering that it inflicts on people in the actual process of killing them, and because it disproportionately impacts people who are poor and to me, it's really obvious that it's not constitutional, but I'm neither on the Supreme Court nor someone on the Supreme Court commanding a majority. So I think for the time being, we have the death penalty.
Yeah, and your arguments are worked on me. I'm convinced. Do you think restorative justice could ever become a part of our institutional justice system?
I do. And you had DA Boudin on last week, and he campaigned on the promise that he would offer restorative justice to any victim that wanted it. He didn't say instead of, but he said, we're going to work to offer this to you. And I think that's becoming part of the platforms of more and more progressive prosecutors who are understanding that you can incorporate restorative justice in various ways. It could be an alternative. So in Brooklyn, even in cases of serious and violent crimes, they'll ask victims, do you want the standard process or do you want this restorative alternative? And 90% of the time they pick the restorative alternative. So I think it's a matter of these programs really catching fire and being replicated in various jurisdictions across the country. But I am hopeful that that's going to happen more and more because the results are so significant in terms of victim satisfaction when you ask victims how they feel about their experience, and in terms of recidivism. These programs tend to have much, much lower rates of recidivism.
This is a question related to the earlier question about technology. It's way easier for people who've been wrongfully convicted in Maine to know people who've been wrongfully convicted in Idaho. Is there a way in which these new communications processes are going to help to speed up implementation of restorative justice in various jurisdictions?
I really hope so, because I think that these programs have a high success rate. And so one thing that they're able to do is have these very positive outcomes and positive stories. But you're right, I think the programs need to do more to kind of publicize that. And part of that is really public storytelling about the power of restorative justice and about showing in particular cases the kinds of outcomes that it had. And I think once it becomes not a foreign term, but actually a term that people can readily understand, that doesn't need to be defined. And once people can point to an example, whether it's in their state or a neighboring state, of a case that resonates with them, the more likely people are to ask for it, and then the more likely people are to campaign promising it.
You mentioned like Native American and Native peoples having processes like this. I definitely encourage you to ask Heidi about just like kind of restorative justice processes in Hawaiian culture. It'll be a good conversation. Another question we have, and this is one I don't completely understand, but you might understand it better than me. It's this: some things can't and shouldn't be monetized. Is there any discussion or thinking happening about other means of achieving justice for the wrongfully accused?
I think that question is going to the issue of compensation, and this idea that you can make up for a harm by saying to someone, okay, well, you've done 10 years in prison, so here's $1 million, and that's going to kind of magically solve all your problems. This idea that you can put a price on decades of being locked up for something that you didn't do. And I agree that that is not, I think that it is important to compensate people, because what you are telling them is that their life has value, but that cannot be the end of it, because you're saying, well, your life has this fixed monetary value and I have nothing to do with your healing or your journey forward after this. And so I don't think you can monetize exoneration. I don't think you can monetize wrongful conviction. I think that money can help people, and that they are entitled to money for the years lost, for the wages not earned, for all of the emotional suffering. But I don't think that can be the beginning, middle, and end of the story.
Yeah, that's a good answer. I agree too, that money can't measure value in every respect. Here's another question. Can you speak to restorative justice programs in our public schools? So that was a part of your analysis.
So that's a place where restorative justice has gone on, at least in the Bay Area. We're seeing a lot of it, for example, in the Oakland Unified School District. And, it's in part this understanding that, first of all, the way that we've been disciplining kids is, surprise, surprise, racist. So that in California, Black and brown children are 3 to 6 times as likely to be suspended or expelled for the same behavior that's committed by white children. And also this understanding that once you impose those kinds of severe consequences, you're more likely to drive young people into the criminal system because they're essentially being deprived of an education. Also, there's an understanding that we know a lot about the juvenile brain, about how it's developing, about how young people are really works in progress and grow and change. And so all of those things have led school administrators in some parts of the country, including Oakland, to embrace restorative justice and try to use it in cases of school misconduct and issues between students, even violent issues, as an alternative to just sort of throwing up their hands or chucking out the person that they see as the problem child. And I think that is something that is taking hold, and we're seeing more and more of it, and that's very encouraging.
What do you think of the next book on restorative justice is going to look like? Your book has certain elements, but do you see, like, are you going to continue with this project in terms of your writing and analysis, or is this pretty much your statement on restorative justice?
So I'm not sure if I have another book in me about it, but I have been writing about it. I've been writing about it a little bit sort of publicly in op-eds and essays, and also in some scholarship that I've been doing. And so I've been recently thinking a lot about it, actually, in the context of sexual assault. And I'm not talking about wrongful convictions and misidentifications. I'm talking about cases where there's been a violent assault within a consensual relationship, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, or stranger attacks. And I've done a lot of research and looking into this issue of, it's complicated, but sex crimes are the least prosecuted felony in the United States. And that's been true for decades. And even though we've made some forward strides in making things more fair for victims and not sort of putting victims on trial in the same way, it's also true that it's just much less likely that the police will refer those kinds of cases for prosecution, or that prosecutors will take them, because they can be really hard. And so oftentimes victims get nothing. And oftentimes what they're offered is to go forward with this process that can be very re-traumatizing and possibly not result in a conviction, or maybe result in one, but not in a way that's empowering to them, or not in a way that they desired, or nothing. And that kind of all or nothing approach has been, I think, a failure, a documented failure. And so there has been a movement toward at least considering restorative justice for survivors who want that, who prefer that, or see value in that, versus going through an adversarial process that is unlikely, statistically speaking, to work out in the way that it's promised.
Yeah, and that's so fascinating. You described the need, and I completely can understand that. So I'm glad you're paying attention to what society needs, and that's kind of directing what your research and your energy and your work is going toward. But we're completely running out of time. We have 2 minutes left, 1 minute left. And I wonder if you could just tell me just some, like I said, the people I'm talking to, they're getting COVID, their friends are getting COVID, the economy's is causing so much suffering. And then we had the environmental disaster of the wildfires in the West. Now we have everything around the election. What signs of hope do you see that can help us to get a little perspective on our historical moment?
So I don't pretend to always stick to this, but my philosophy is to play the long game. And that's how I try to think about the most torturous times, that there's going to be an after to that even in the darkest moments, there's this place that we move to. That's a better place, even though we have to go through a very dark and broken part to get there. And maybe it's naive and I'm just overly optimistic, but I truly believe that we tend toward that place of healing, and that place of overcoming, and that place of things getting better. But at the same time, I also completely empathize and relate to this feeling of despair, because it does seem like just when it can't get any darker, there's another COVID uptick, or there's another wildfire, or there's another shooting of an unarmed Black man in the streets. And you just sort of think, well, how are we ever going to come out of this? But the truth is, our country has a way of coming out of things, not in a perfect way, but in a way that makes us more civil and more just. And so I just firmly believe that. And that's, I guess, what I can offer, not a magic solution, but just a real belief in the innate goodness of other human beings, and a belief that we are moving forward, even though sometimes it looks like we're lurching backward.
Oh, thanks so much, Laura. I want just to make quick announcements. Please join me next week when my guest will be Dorsey Nunn, Executive Director of Legal Services for Prisoners with Children and co-founder of All of Us or None. We'll be talking about Proposition 17, voting rights for parolees, and the movement to restore the human and civil rights for formerly and currently incarcerated people. You can help us bring the arts to life at Grace with a gift today to the forum. Please visit gracecathedral.org/give to Grace. And thanks again, Laura. What a blessing. I know how busy you are. I felt guilty about asking you to do this, but we're so glad to have you. And it's so important that more people understand these issues. I really do recommend your book very highly to people I see and who care about what's going on in the criminal justice system.
It is such an honor to be with you, and thank you. I loved it. I loved being in conversation with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and don't worry about the dog. We could hear a little tiny bit, but we mostly heard you.
Pandemic puppy. Yep.
I know. Our dog looks like a puppy, but isn't a puppy. That's actually the best combination of dog qualities.
Totally. Yes, mine is sweet, but a bit yappy. So I apologize to everybody.
All right. Well, good night, everyone, and thanks for joining us for the forum.
Thank you so much.